Okay. Oh, I saw I woke a couple of people up there. That's so I know it's the Sunday afternoon post-prandial shift, so people can get a bit sleepy. But I'm fairly confident that during this session, you'll be very lively and awake, thanks to our guest Julie Klinger. I can promise you this is going to be an interesting, a really engaging session. So Julie is an assistant professor at the University of Delaware in the program on geography and spatial sciences, but she has in the past been an assistant professor of international relations, which when you're talking about rare earth minerals and critical raw materials is incredibly useful, having both a geography background and an IR background, as you will discover. So she studies the geography, geology, and geopolitics of development and resource usage, and has carried out in-depth fieldwork in China, Brazil, and other countries, including Sweden, that are affected by the mining of rare earth elements. She is the author of the award-winning Rare Earth Frontiers, From Terrestrial Subsoils to Lunar Landscapes, which is how I got to know about her in the first place. And this traces the history and use of rare earths from the 1880s to the present. And I'm also pleased to announce that next spring she will be a fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences here in Vienna. So, Julie, welcome to the Vienna Humanities Festival. It's great to have you here. We're going to be talking about rare earths, rare earth minerals, but we're also going to be talking about critical raw minerals, their extraction, the relationship to the environment, and the geopolitical implications of these materials. So, just so everyone knows where we are, and we can start on the same page, there are 17 rare earth elements, and these are included in what the US Geographical Survey has deemed to be 51 critical raw minerals, or CRMs. So, let's start with the rare earths, Julie. What are they, and why are they important?
Oh, thank you, and thanks for having me, Misha. It's been a wonderful, wonderful time at this festival. So the term rare earth elements, it's a bit of an anachronism because these elements are neither rare nor necessarily earths. But they do refer to, if you can picture the periodic table of elements, that island to the south, right? That's the lanthanide series, numbers 57 to 71, as well as scandium and yttrium. And they're grouped together as a family because they have these really fantastic magnetic and conductive properties that have enabled the miniaturization of technologies, that have enabled transoceanic internet communications, the development of space technologies, etc. Can I tell them why they're called rare?
Yes, of course.
So the name sticks around, I think, because it's exciting. It's more exciting than saying lanthanum or praseodymium. But really, at all my research in trying to find out why they were called rare, it came down to this. When they were first characterized in Sweden in the late 1700s, no one had ever seen them before, and so they were simply assumed to be rare. And the first time I found a chemist lamenting this in print was in 1907. Right, so since 1907, the scientific community has been pretty cranky about this characterization, but it sticks around because I think if you call something rare, then we get excited. And people might agree to things that they might otherwise quite sensibly refuse.
So their properties, as you say, are extraordinary, and they're used in all sorts of things, civilian use, military use. Can you give us a couple of examples of the more sort of wacky and out there usages of rare earths, but which are really important for us nonetheless?
Sure, yeah. Gosh, you could really pick any element. But we'll go with cerium. So actually, we'll go with cerium because in a city like Vienna, there's probably lovely antique glassware. That's a lovely rosy pink, right? It's cerium that that imparts that nice rosy pink color onto the glassware. It's that same pigmenting property that is used to make lasers that are used in everything from surgery to precision-guided missiles. Also, cerium acts as a signal amplifier when it's added to fiber optic cables. So if you can picture the global mesh of transoceanic fiber optic cables, about every 30 kilometers or so, there's a little bit of cerium that just amplifies the signal.
And without Serium, we couldn't do that, right?
Well, we could, but it would be slower, and who wants to go slower, right?
So there are all sorts of things. Presidium. Let's talk about neopresidium and why that's so important, because and the issue of magnets and
Sure.
what that does for possibilities of green transition.
Sure. I will say one more thing about cerium first, which is that cerium has been really important over the 20th century and into the 21st century because it's used in petroleum refining. And in fact, until very recently, the primary application for rare earth elements in the United States was in the petrochemical industry. That's only very recently been edged out by magnets, so like neodymium and praseodymium. And these are important because they're used in renewable energy technologies, among many others, as well as in digital technologies. And so, for example, picture a wind turbine. Right? Magnets are really important in the actual mechanics of the wind turbine that help translate the motion of the wind turbine into energy generation. And so depending on the size of the wind turbine, you might have a few kilos to a couple of tons of magnets in there. And when it comes to digital technologies, it's that conductive and magnetic power that enables them to be smaller, more modular, more portable, and therefore ultimately more accessible. And so in any scenario that we're looking at here, whether we're talking about energy development, renewable or non, or if we're talking about increased access to technology, any of these scenarios requires these rare earth elements. And I think the same can be said for just about everything else that's on a critical raw materials list.
So just one thing about the rare earths. So we've established they're not rare, they're found in all sorts of places all over the world, but for a lot of them, you have to extract a great deal of aggregate, of rock, in order to get them, because they're present in lots of places, but they're very small in, I mean, there's not much of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they don't exist like in the form of gold nuggets,
right?
I guess you could say. So yeah, when we're talking about 17 chemically similar elements, we're confronting a very particular extraction challenge. So the first challenge is finding a deposit that contains any of them at a concentration that might be economically feasible. And just to give you a sense of the proportions that we're talking about here, if you have a big area or a geological deposit that has many, many, many millions of tons of material, if 2% of that contains rare earth elements, that's considered a really good deal. But that also gives you a sense of the quantity of energy and earth moving that's involved in getting at the stuff that the company wants. And everything else, whatever it may be, whether it's gold or silver or phosphate or uranium or thorium, arsenic, is left above ground as waste. Right, so think about that. 98% of the stuff that's dug up, under a good scenario, 98% of the stuff that's dug up is left behind as waste. Depends on the operation, yeah. But the other thing is that because they are so chemically similar, separating them is very challenging. So a lot of the science of the 20th century was devoted to figuring out how to crack these things apart. And so the upshot there is that separating them and refining them is very energy intensive and also often very chemically intensive as well.
Okay, before we go on to some of the political environmental stuff, We're also going to be talking about critical raw materials. So we're talking about lithium, nickel, cobalt, copper. And all of this is important for various aspects of the green transition. So my question is, Julie, how much of this stuff are we going to have to dig up relative to the amount of stuff we've been digging up until now in order to power the green transition?
I came
Roughly.
prepared for this question.
Oh, good.
Let me consult my notes. So this is the International Energy Agency estimated that between 2017 and 2022, there was a threefold increase in global demand for lithium, a 70% increase in global demand for cobalt, which is used in batteries, and a 40% increase in global demand for nickel, which is also used in batteries. They're big numbers, but it's not surprising, right? On one hand, this is good news. It means that we're moving forward in terms of rapid deployment for renewable energy technologies. But there's a lot that's really hidden in these numbers. Simply to say that a battery, even though a battery in and of itself is a renewable energy technology, it may not actually be used for climate critical purposes. I think the most vivid example of this has to do with lithium batteries. There was a social media phenomenon several months ago where there was this revelation that a big driver for the increase in demand for small-scale lithium batteries was actually the proliferation of vaping pens, right? Not necessarily a climate-critical application, right? But less frivolously, one of the brilliant PhD researchers that I'm working with has been looking at the military capture of renewable energy technologies. And there's a big push in the US military to develop assault rifles that are, of course, powered by lithium batteries. Right, so there we have a significant increase that is in part, yes, significantly driven by renewable energy applications, but not all renewable energy applications are climate critical.
And of course, with some of these technologies you're talking about, that was 2017 to 2022. We've still got a long way to go before we reach peak on any of this.
Absolutely.
Right?
I think copper is a good example there. So humming through our wires, right? Copper is what's enabling electricity to move from here to there. So it's important for electrification in general, but certainly when it comes to the energy technology and digitization pushes that are really at the heart of our current climate and development goals. So we're expecting that copper consumption between 2009 up until 2030, if we meet the COP28 targets for 3 times renewable capacity by 2030, that will mean that copper consumption will exceed all global copper production in human history up until 2009.
God, well, that gives us a sense of the scale.
So that's just a sense of the scale of the things that we're talking about.
Now, as we know, China dominates much of the market in rare earths and indeed critical raw minerals, but in particular in the processing of these elements and minerals. Much of the research you did for your book was carried out in Bayan Obo, in China's Inner Mongolia. Now, this is a big center for rare earth extraction and to some extent processing, I believe. It's an opportunity which I cannot believe you would be able to be offered today because of political circumstances. So can you give us a bit of a sense of what it was like in the working in the heartland of China's rare earth, and your impressions of the whole this massive operation, which also some people argue, including you, is massively polluting as well. What was it? What's that like? I mean, this is the heart of the rare earths industry.
Oh, that's a great question. And I agree with you. I think it would be very difficult to do that research today. For context, I lived and worked in China for a total of about 5 years over a 10-year period between 2003 and 2013. And when I came to doing my research on rare earth elements for the book, that was after having lived and worked in China then for a total of almost 4 years. And so I had the professional contacts, including in academia and in the government, to be able to ask these sorts of questions. And at the time, these sorts of questions asked by a scholar with several years of experience in China, they were received as in a way that, I mean, it's lovely. It was an opportunity to advance mutual understanding, right? So I think we need a little bit more of that today. But it meant, though, that in order to do research in the rare earth capital of the world, which is a military restricted area, it required a lot of patience and lead-up time, talking with multiple people, informing them about my questions and my intentions, and then ultimately visiting the same place in multiple ways, escorted by multiple different parties. But I'll tell you an extraordinary story, because in the book I write about, really the strength and robustness of China's industrial heartland around rare earth mining and processing co-evolved with their nuclear weapons industry. And I didn't go in knowing this. And in fact, it was entire happenstance that I even found out, because in my first officially organized visit to Baotou and Bayan Obo, which was arranged by my host institution, the China Academy of Sciences, 2 weeks before I was scheduled to arrive in Baotou, there had been some pretty major unrest that was driven by ethnic Mongolian pastoralists who, a member of their community had been hit and killed by a truck transporting mineral ore, and they had protested. And the protests had escalated. And there was evidence of property damage. And so the official word was that, and I don't know what the logic was here, that it would be too problematic to cancel my visit. However, no one was to talk to me about mining. So I got a very different tour of the city, in which I think people kind of in a moment of desperation to try and fill up the space were pointing out all sorts of things to me. And one of the things that was pointed out to me was like, this is our nuclear weapons development facility. And that generated a whole bunch of follow-up questions, which I think under any other circumstances would have been, I would have felt maybe were too taboo to ask. But under those circumstances, we had quite a conversation. And that then, of course, generated leads for me to look at the overlap and the co-development of these industries from the mid-20th century onward. Right? So there was a lot of serendipity involved, too.
Yeah. And what about the issue of pollution and Bayanobo? Because that's a really big issue in China, isn't it?
Yeah, it certainly is. And there are a number of these, in Chinese, it's like literally industrial foundation, gongchanjidi, and they're part of like the early, like post-revolutionary China industrial planning exercise that they undertook in collaboration with the former Soviet Union before they kind of broke up. But the idea is that these places would be industrial heartlands that would, help power the development and self-sufficiency of China, supported by the Soviet Union, and then together, China and the Soviet Union would provide the hard industrial goods and know-how to the rest of the world in order to achieve a sort of world communist revolution. Right? So that's the thinking. And so mid-20th century, a number of these places are set up around the country. Baotou is the priority area number one, right? With the rare earth elements, the heavy industry, and also the weapons development. And so the priority there since the 1950s had been build out as much industry as quickly as possible, expand the scope of mining operations as quickly as possible, and waste management really was not a priority. However, there's very careful documentation and tracking of soil pollution because of concerns with agricultural productivity, and water pollution because of concerns with aquaculture productivity and drinking water. But it wasn't until a kind of critical period in the early 2000s that scientific data, combined with local activism and dedicated environmental journalists within China, actually enabled a shift in China's priorities from industrial development above all else to actually looking at environmental remediation.
Because the rare earth mining creates this sort of sludge.
Yeah, maybe I'll step back and kind of describe it. Should I do that?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I already mentioned that best case scenario, you might have a 2% concentration. Some pockets of the deposit might have up to 20%, but if you're mining over a large area, 2% is considered a good average. It just so happens that one of the other elements, or a couple of the other elements that are abundant in this particular deposit are arsenic and thorium, fluorite, as well as uranium. And although there's, of course, secondary processing to capture some of these materials from the waste, for 40 or 50 years, you had abundant quantities of arsenic and fluoride just being brought up out of the earth, pulverized, of course, so that as part of the separations process, but that also makes them more mobile. They proliferate in dust, they get into the waterways, and so the uptake of these contaminants by plants and animals has made its way all the way up the food chain, so that there's extensive long-term public health studies about the impacts of this contamination on infant and child cognitive development, advanced sorts of bone diseases and specific ailments that result from chronic exposure to these things.
Right. So if we're going to dig up all this stuff in order to affect the green transition, then regulatory systems are going to be really, really important in all of this. I want to move us on, if possible, to the geopolitics of everything.
Sure.
So the United States used to be the #1 producer of rare earths, and then in its strategy of turning China into the manufacturing heartland of the United States, one of the industries which went over there was rare earth extraction and processing. Yeah. And the Chinese now have 30 years or so experience, of 35 years of processing these materials, and can do it a lot more cheaply than anyone else. So given the centrality to both military and civilian uses and to the green transition, what does that mean in terms of geopolitics relationships between the US, China, and the EU?
This is a really important question. I will say that for the most part, most of the time, including in the present, and this is a very unpopular thing to say in the US right now, but China's a reliable trade partner with the US. And so, the intense investments that China's government and industries made in building up their industrial capacity and their manufacturing capacity fit perfectly with the Washington-driven sort of free trade industry relocation doctrines of the past 40 years or so. And for a while, I don't want to say everyone was happy, but it was a relationship that really didn't garner the kind of concern that we've seen in the past decade. But what it translated into is that a lot of critical technological components, whether it's for healthcare or scientific instrumentation, as well as military technologies, the raw materials, the raw material refining, the components manufacture, and the components assembly has concentrated in China. And so, the US Department of Defense kind of woke up to this about 15 years ago and decided that it was a real problem, and has since then been shopping for alternatives, while also continuing to receive on a reliable basis many of these components from counterparts and manufacturers in China. There's more I could say there, but I want to ask.
Well, what's interesting is one of the things this has led to is what I called in a BBC documentary that I did, in which Julia played a central role, called The Scramble for Rare Earths. and we have now a global scramble, primarily between the US and China, latterly the EU as well, trying to secure the supply chains.
Yeah.
So tell us a bit about the supply chains and their complexity.
Okay, excellent. So it's interesting. The criticality of these materials doesn't, in most cases, have to do with their absolute scarcity. It has to do with the geography of the supply chains and how those supply chains are organized. And so the fact that a lot of the central processing and indeed high technology manufacturing and assembly steps are concentrated in China does, if you consider some less rosy geopolitical scenarios, it does constitute a very real vulnerability. And that vulnerability, of course, in the U.S. context is often described in terms of military vulnerability. In fact, there's this kind of, very gallows humor, but this recent DoD report that was projecting out the material needs for, say, a hypothetical war with China by 2027, and one of their conclusions was that maybe that wouldn't be feasible because so much of the important components for defense technologies come from China. So, right, we'll just leave that where it is. But an important thing that has happened over the past 15 years is that the geography of extraction has really changed. So places like the US, Myanmar, Vietnam, Brazil, Madagascar, different parts of the world are supplying raw material. But because of that critical middle step, or sort of early middle step of refining and separating these materials, most of it is still routed through China. And so what the US and the EU have been working on is really building out that value-added processing in order to have sort of more independent capabilities in this area. However, there are three scenarios under which we quote unquote don't have enough raw materials to meet our energy transition goals. And I can get into the other two maybe in the Q&A, but one of them is that if we in fact, under a global scramble for rare earth elements and other energy critical raw materials, we have the global duplication of supply chains and efforts, right? Absent any sort of framework that thinks about, okay, how much of these things are actually needed in a given territory or context in order to achieve energy transition goals. So under this scramble that's happening that you've talked about, Misha, it's all parties are going for as much capacity as possible, irrespective of how much might actually be needed for critical purposes such as the energy transition.
So we get an over-extraction, and we'll come back to that at the end, because I know you've got you've been developing some ideas about how you avoid that. But before we get there, a couple of more questions I've got is so since the Cold War, the West has periodically introduced technology export controls. Yes. On usually on dual-use technologies. This was a quite well-codified system during the Cold War through Comecon. Through COCOM, I beg your pardon. And more recently, however, the Americans in the last 10 to 15 years, when they started to panic a bit about China's development and rivalry and competitiveness and so on and so forth, they've started restricting, the Americans have started, with the collusion of the Europeans, started restricting Chinese access to manufactured materials, in particular microchips, and the most advanced microchips, about 89% of which are all manufactured in one place in Taiwan, ironically, just across the straits. But China, for the first time, the West is having to take some of its own medicine, because China has started to impose export controls both on processing technology of rare earths, which they do more or less better than anyone else now, but also on the rare earths themselves. How much of a tool is this? How powerful a lever is this for the Chinese to use with, say, gallium and germanium, which are two of the rare earths which they're restricting at the moment?
So there's a couple of ways in which that's a really powerful diplomatic and geopolitical tool, and then there's a bunch of other ways in which restricting those two things specifically allows a lot of business as usual to continue, right? So I think it's important to kind of keep this complex supply chain picture in mind, in part because China is not simply a source market for a lot of these technologies, but is also a major consuming market for finished technologies that might be finished in the West and then exported back to China. So with those particular export controls that you've mentioned, I mean, it's enough to send a little bit of a shock, right? Markets certainly react to this sort of thing. But the export controls on the most advanced processing and separations technologies is a pretty direct blow, like particularly to efforts in the US and EU to build out this capacity. Because when you're building out this capacity, you want to go with the state-of-the-art technology and equipment. And where is the state-of-the-art technology and equipment? It's located, of course, in China, right? And that makes sense because they've had 40 years of working on this and supplying most of the world. Whereas over that same 40-year period, the US and the EU not only drew down industrial capacity, but also research and development capacity. So what it has, I can give an example of what this has meant in the US context. So there's one particular company in the US that's really excited about getting up and running. And for the past, I don't know, 4 years now, it's always been like in 18 months, we'll be producing stuff in 18 months, and 18 months, and 18 months, right? And delays are common, of course, in getting new industrial operations off the ground. But the hang-up for them every single time has been getting access to the technology that they need. And so the first time, their plan was they had a deal with a Chinese supplier to purchase some of these processing technologies, and they realized that these were technologies that were appropriate for a context where, say, labor was less expensive. And so they required a lot of human labor and expertise for the processes to work, and that didn't align with this company's strategy, right? They wanted something more automated. Right, so that was a further delay. They found another supplier, but then this restriction came in. And so now they're really in a difficult situation, right, where they need to figure out how to make it all work without even really having access to a prototype, right? And so this is a government level restriction, but I will say at like a day-to-day business level, there's people on both sides who are pretty annoyed by this.
So,
Right.
but the point, exactly, and the point is that both sides have leverage here, and if it's not properly managed, then it could turn nasty at some point. And why there are some voices in the United States saying actually quite loudly now, you know, careful about how far you go on restrictions to Chinese companies because it might come back and bite us in the end. I think that's the dynamic at the moment, if I'm correct. There are two more areas I want to cover before I go to Q&A. First of all, the more out there ways of getting hold of rare earths and critical raw minerals. The first one is deep sea, and the second one, which you've written about in Rare Earth Frontiers, is the moon. So, and why people might be going to the moon. So tell us about what's happening with deep sea and what the dangers of deep sea mining are, And then also whether this idea of extracting rare earths from the moon is nuts or whether we ought to take it seriously.
All right. Yeah, the deep sea, and I'm going to actually scoot back a little bit so I can look at the audience without being blinded by
you're being
this
blinded
glorious
by the
sunlight.
sun. I'm sorry about that.
No, go ahead and be comfortable here. There we go. Yeah, there we are.
Or you can sit here if you like. I don't mind being blinded by the sun.
All right.
Yep.
Yeah.
Let's see you later. Carry on talking.
Lovely. Okay. So the deep sea, can I just get a sense of how many folks in the room have heard about deep sea mining? Right? Yeah, most of you in the room, right? So it's this idea that, or the way that it's represented is there's these lumpy nodules of lots of different metals that are just sitting there on the ocean floor, waiting to be vacuumed up, right? And that makes it so much easier, so much less controversial than terrestrial mining because one, nobody lives there, and two, you don't have to dig any holes, right, to get them. And so at that level, it seems like a very compelling alternative to terrestrial surface mining, particularly when you consider the human rights violations and the environmental impacts that plague the industry. However, we have explored more of the moon than we've explored of the deep seabed, and also, so in a way, we're kind of tinkering with the unknown, right? And this has been one of the reasons why there's been global campaigns to get major potential consumers of these battery metals to sign a moratorium or to swear, right, to promise, to pledge that they would not use materials acquired through deep sea mining. The other thing, though, is that one of the things that we do know about this deep sea ecosystem is that there's this wonderful system of methane-gobbling microorganisms that are performing a critical climate service for us. Methane seeps up through the ocean floor, and they eat it up, so it doesn't escape into the atmosphere. And we know that that's significant because other previous non-anthropogenic climate warming events have been caused in part by these like massive belches of methane from the deep ocean. And so potentially what we're looking at here is destabilizing a largely unknown ecosystem that is performing a really critical climate function for us in the name of fighting climate change, right, in the form of the energy transition.
So clearly, I mean, people feel very anxious about deep sea mining. There are some people who are very keen to get it going, but there are definitely very serious known unknowns about this. What about the moon stuff?
Sure. So there was another moment of serendipity when I was researching this book. I was back in the San Francisco Bay Area in between research trips to China, and I went to a very nerdy sort of party where we all brought our favorite board games, and ended up playing a board game with someone who, upon asking me what I was working on, hearing that I said rare earth elements, noted to me that his company had just signed a $10 million contract with NASA to develop a robot to mine these things on the moon.
Wow.
So a little bit of serendipity there. Ultimately, so this was part of a much larger X Prize co-sponsored by Google that was going to award $20 million to a company that could deploy a robot on the moon for whatever purpose, but a number of them had seized on the geopolitical crisis of the 2010s that swirled around rare earth elements to say, we're going to get these things from outer space and not from China. None of those panned out, right? But what I came to understand through researching the space mining industry is that, one, for a fair number of them, the objective was never to actually meet their stated objective, but to develop some interesting technologies and maybe be bought up by a larger entity, and so they could cash out and move on to the next thing. The second thing was that, if you talk to folks who are really serious about developing space mining capabilities, and there are engineering programs at top universities, such as the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia, where you can get engineering PhDs in space mining systems and what have you, they are thinking about it strictly in terms of long-term space travel, long-term space missions. So you don't have to take everything you need from Earth to do interesting stuff in outer space. And from a sustainability standpoint, that makes sense. And then there's the space cowboys. And I think we're all familiar with a couple of prominent space cowboys. But their objective is to, the sea studying thing of maybe 15 years ago didn't really pan out so much. So this is a kind of recapitulation of that with respect to setting up these kind of libertarian colonies or luxury resorts on the moon or on Mars. And so these are, in a way, these are kind of yet another manifestation of a long-standing tendency, I would say, significantly empowered by the rise of the billionaire capitalist as a figure. But to come all the way back around to the question of criticality and provisioning the energy transition, there's really no plausible scenario under which mining in space to provision activities on Earth makes economic sense, much less sense from an emissions or technology standpoint, right?
Julie, one quick final question. This is, although it's a complicated question, but I do want to get it in before going over to the audience, is I said that you were developing some ideas about how to avoid the issues around the supply chain scrambles and mess. Can you sort of briefly outline what that is?
Oh, okay, thank you. So earlier this year, the UN Secretary General put together a panel on critical minerals and materials for the energy transition. And earlier this month, they published their 7 principles and action items. And they emphasize cooperation, justice, transparency, benefit for communities in provisioning the renewable energy transition. And this is important because, one of the numbers that I didn't cite earlier, but say the World Bank projects that global production of these things all across the board, right? If you average things, needs to increase 4 to 6-fold in order to meet the renewable energy targets by 2030 and the net zero targets by 2040 and 2050. So the question is then, how do you do this in a way that doesn't just cause already the tremendous social and environmental violence that's associated with extractive industries just to metastasize, right? But in the name of fighting climate change, which undermines climate resilient landscapes and livelihoods, right? So it's a real conundrum. But of their principles, principle number 7 stated that multilateral cooperation must underpin efforts to actually provision the energy transition. And so my team, we've developed some ideas. I don't think I'm violating my publishing embargo by sharing it here.
Don't think you are either.
Oh, yeah. But we have a piece that's due to come out in the Nature family of journals any day now that's outlining a framework for a nationally determined contributions approach to energy transition materials. And so this works within the national determined contribution framework that really distinguished the 2015 Paris Accords for each party to determine how many units they actually need of a given energy transition material, right? Because there's all sorts of data about, about capacity and what have you, but it tends to be expressed in watts and not in terms of the actual hard materials that you need to build this infrastructure. It also calls for parties to do an inventory of their reserves, prioritizing above ground reserves, right? And the key thing here, and I say prioritizing above ground reserves, this is the stuff that has already been dug up, that is languishing as waste, that may be in a landfill in the form of a decommissioned or discarded technology. Because the key thing that I think we need to remember here is that these critical raw materials are fundamentally different from fossil fuels, in that when you use a fossil fuel, you combust it, right, to perform its function. But with many of these other things, it's simply, we don't destroy them through use. They're sitting above ground. And then the other is to do an inventory of domestic climate assets. So what is a climate asset, right? That's biodiversity. Those are resilient landscapes. Those are freshwater resources. These are things that are codified under any number of environmental protection measures, but they perform critical social and ecological services and enhance local and regional resilience. And so the idea there is that if you look at your map of your reserves and you look at your map of your climate assets, what's left are the potential areas for industry development, right? And these, of course, can be decided in a context-appropriate referendum, vote, plebiscite, what have you. Of course, it has to be determined by a given country. But we're excited that, that there's been positive responses to this idea as a potential thing to incorporate into the Conference of Parties kind of going forward.
Julie, thanks so much for all of that. And straight away to the audience, because I know I've slightly run over time.
Well, thank you very much for your most interesting speech. It was mentioned that China is sort of monopolizing raw materials, and as a matter of fact, I would like to point out to one thing. Not only in China itself, the production is enormous, but let's take, for instance, Argentina, where 47 mines, lithium mines, were bought recently by China. Previous presidency, not the current one in Argentina, as an example. So are we totally falling behind? Especially Europe, when we discussed Mercosur for years and it was blocked. We are thinking in standards, and China is thinking in pure power. So what's the outcome? Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, that's an excellent question. I mean, what you're describing is another form that the scramble for these materials is taking, right? And so what we're seeing is, of course, China is leading in either outright acquisitions or partial or minority stakes in extractive operations at different parts of the world. And rather than working to make collaborations, overtures to achieve some kind of global coordination around this, I can say that for the US's part, they're trying to compete on those same terms. And that is a recipe that only leads to further scrambles and conflicts and ultimately greater scarcity. And so that is the game that needs to change.
Is there a danger, just on that, of are the producer nations, the place where the material actually is, are they, given the experience of oil, given the experience of colonialism, are they better prepared to retain the value in their territory than was the case in previous historical eras? I.e., can they defend themselves against another resource colonialism?
It's interesting. It really depends by country, but there's a lot of experiments happening globally with nationalizing industry, with imposing export barriers. So Indonesia with nickel, I think, is the most iconic example, where they've said basically, hey, rest of the world, if you want access to Indonesia's nickel, you have to build your facilities here, right? And so they have courted investment from China, from the US, from the EU. And there's a number of other global south countries that are watching that and thinking about how they might implement that in their own territory. However, there is also in several of these contexts a living memory of direct US intervention in attempts to nationalize industries. So there's a lot of tentativeness there as well.
Softly.
Yes.
Yes.
I've got two questions. One, it seems to me, well, there's the sourcing of the raw material, and then there's the processing, and as you say, most of it takes place in China. I was interested by your example in the United States of this company who tried to do it, and I think you mentioned that they didn't have the skilled workforce. I mean, do we in Europe, or do you in the United States have the skilled engineers and chemists and so on, or enough of them to actually do that, or is that something that we should be doing to go forward, to be training what is clearly a very specialist job? And then I've got another question, which is, when I listen to all this, the green transition just sounds impossible. So how hopeful are you?
Those are great questions. Well, to the first one, there's a couple of things, right? That there is the technology, the skills, and the know-how exist in both the US and the EU contexts. It's a question of volume. Like, are there enough people, as you pointed out? But also there's another important piece here, is industry willing to pay people what they are worth? Right? And I've been in a number of kind of federal level conversations in the US around building up the critical materials or critical minerals task force. And you have two kind of conversations happening, where you have leaders from industry and research institutions, and you have, you have leaders from universities and research institutions, and you have leaders from industry. And the people from industry are saying there's not enough people. There's not enough skilled workforce, and the people from university are saying that their graduates can't find jobs that will support them, right? That will allow them to pay off their student debt, right? And so I think the thing that's going unsaid here is that in the sort of attempt to move industry back to the US and the EU context, that companies have to readjust to different labor and working conditions, and that includes paying people what they're worth. To the question of hope. I think I'm actually quite hopeful, because I think that we're not dealing with a situation where there's simply not enough raw material. And furthermore, the best available research shows us that there's enough of this stuff available in above ground sources that the energy transition can be provisioned without mining the earth into oblivion. The major piece that we have to work on is the competing uses for materials that are critical for the energy transition. So we need to be having very real conversations around, okay, here is a lithium battery. Does it go into an EV bus, a school bus, or does it go into an EV tank, right? And just to give you a sense here of like the difference that we're talking about, a US school bus with a 300-mile range developed to work in cold and mountainous conditions will require a lithium battery that weighs 4,800 pounds. Right? And that's a lot from a material intensity standpoint, and you can tell a whole story around how maybe it's not sustainable. However, there is also a proposal to develop a tank that is powered by a lithium battery with a 300-mile range that requires a 60,000-pound lithium battery, right? So we really, really have to be having frank conversations around not only do we need this stuff for batteries, but what are those batteries actually being used for? Is it for climate critical or for climate hostile purposes? Right, thank you.
So.
Yeah, you mentioned that some of these materials that we are not destroying them. How far can we possibly go in recycling or circular economy with those materials?
This is excellent. This is one of my favorite things to talk about. So the possibilities for circularity are endless, actually. And when you run into people who tell you that it's not possible, that it's not feasible, that it's too expensive, all they are doing is they are telling us how not to do things. Right? They say it requires too much energy, or it's too difficult to separate out the material that you want, right? How do you get the material that you want from the rest of the stuff that you don't want in this device, for example? But those are solvable problems, right? There are very simple standardization and design mandates that can make technologies more modular and more easily deconstructed. And when you put those in place, which there's standards for all sorts of things, for refrigerators and cars and phone chargers and all of this. Once you put those in place, then you also deal with the energy and potentially residual effluent or pollution problems that result from, you know, the high energy and intense operations that you need to basically separate these pieces out again. Right.
And tailings as well are important, are they not? Because there's a lot of stuff just sitting on the ground there waiting for, waiting to be used.
So much good stuff in tailings, right? 98% of the stuff that's dug up is left behind. And a lot of that stuff is good stuff. And it's not even just that the stuff is left behind, like in the case of a rare earth mine. It's not even just that the stuff left behind is stuff besides rare earths. I said stuff a lot there, but you get my idea. Gadolinium is one example of a rare earth element that is used as an MRI contrast agent. It's also a potential substitute in samarium cobalt magnets, which might reduce the need to source cobalt from the DRC. But under the best case scenario, only 8% of the gadolinium that is dug up makes it out of the mining site. So that means that 92% of the material that's dug up, right, all the work goes into digging this stuff out of the ground, it's left behind as waste. Right, so reprocessing the tailings, improving efficiencies, all of these are easy wins. And I think much easier than digging a new hole in the ground and destroying a landscape, right?
Possibly not quite as profitable, though. Who knows?
Well, it depends on the subsidy regime, I guess, right?
So we got time, I think, for two more questions, one there and then one there.
So, as we are not talking about absolute achievability, reachability of rare earths, more or less, in the end, we are talking about the price. So what would you guess if, for example, the price doubles? What would be the influence on the price we have to pay for the articles we build in the end for a green transition?
Well, that's an interesting thing, right? There's the ceteris paribus response to your question, which is, you know, if nothing else changes and the price doubles, then, I mean, firms will do what they do and they'll pass the cost on to the consumers. But for any single element, there's just very small amounts of it in a device that you or I might use, even in the case of an EV where it might be several kilos. And so we might see a difference of, you know, a few dollars or euros to a few hundred, right? But of course, it's at the discretion of the company and whether they're opportunistic and they leverage the crisis to jack prices up even higher, right? That's a separate thing. But I think that the other way to respond to your question is to point out how price volatility really plays with the scarcity, right? I mean, recently in Australia, there were a couple of lithium mines that closed. Operational lithium mines in Australia closed because the price dropped, right? And so this, of course, has ripple effects, the global supply. And what this all speaks to is just a need for greater coordination, right? And there's the resistance for greater coordination around prices in particular is coming from very specific quarters, right? Namely industry. And Crimea River, I guess.
We've got one more there, and then that's it, I'm afraid.
Thank you. I have two questions, very short. The first is because you just spoke about the 8% of gadolinium. Can you explain why is 92% left in the waste? And the second is there already a trade market for waste?
Yeah, excellent questions. So to answer the first one about gadolinium, it's mainly, most of it is left behind because there is not yet a sufficient global demand that would make putting in the extra effort to capture more of it economically viable for a single mining company to do. Mining companies are after praseodymium and lanthanum and neodymium. And until there is maybe something like a mandate that, say, mandates substituting gadolinium for cobalt, we're unlikely to see investments, right? And then in terms of a trade in waste, could you be more specific? Do you mean e-waste or mine waste? What do you?
The mine waste, because you mentioned that they're storing uranium fluoride, all the material that are used in the nuclear industry. So I wonder if people are not interested. I don't know what the percentage in
Yeah. Okay, yeah, so the question was, whether there was already a trade in, say, for the uranium or the thorium or other elements that are of interest to other industries. And I will say that there's an interest, but there's very different kind of permitting barriers and liabilities around reprocessing tailings waste, so that when it does happen, it typically tends to be done as an additional investment by the current operation, or they'll partner with another entity, so that other entity can be wholly or partially covered by the permitting regime that is governing the current extractive operation. There's one other kind of novel form that's emerged in the US, which is a limited liability corporation buys, say, an old lead mine that's rich in cobalt, and they assume all of the risk and all of the liability and take all of the permitting responsibility, and then they lease the extraction rights to, say, a cobalt mining operation. And so for the folks who are legal scholars in the room, you can kind of maybe get a sense of what's happening here. If there is, say, a revelation of lead contamination or environmental violations, the mining company has clean hands, and the LLC can dissolve. Right? And so that's another kind of dynamic that's happening. There's a lot more work to be done in this area. Short answer.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure, like me, you feel much the wiser having listened to Julie for an hour. But in addition to that, I hope you feel relieved that we have people of her intellect and integrity who are working on this central issue in global politics and economics and society. Julie, a stormy round of applause for you.